my lovely sisters and brothers. Welcome. Welcome to a second live book reading for today. Um, I have the coming days some other things to do, so that is why I am doing a double reading. I pick up the story of ISIS and the war on Bloodlines, written by Wes Penre. And today we do the Templars and the Holy Grail, which is chapter 10, and then chapter 11, Wars of the Roses. So let us start. The Templars and the Holy Grail in the Wes Penre papers. These papers, you can download them for free on the mentioned websites in the text box. In the Wes Penre story, better said, in the Wes Penre papers, the story about the Bloodlines and the Holy Grail, the Knights Templar, Isis being Mary Magdalene, and more of the rest of the story is described in the second level of learning and also in the fourth level of learning. The page numbers listed in this section will be from the PDF versions of the levels of learning, which can be found here. Well, wespennry.com/7-first-2-5-level-of-learning-in-PDF. Most of the information is in the fourth level, and it is spread among those papers. Taking the vast number of papers at all levels of learning, respectively, very few people remember it all. And the section or sections about the Bloodlines and the Holy Grail have largely been forgotten by most. I think, therefore, I will cite myself in this chapter as a reminder from what I discussed with the Orion, or better known as Ariane, because that is the official name, source on the subject and published. There is a hidden so-called Holy Grail bloodline, which the elite want to keep as pure as they possibly can. Of course, many of these elite members have bastard offspring, but they were more or less cast out and created their own watered-down bloodlines all over the world. Therefore, we have the Morgans, the Buchanans, and the Bowers, etc., amongst regular people as well, although those names are elite bloodlines. Some of these people claim family ties to the super-rich elite, and on some level the ties are there, but they would hardly ever be acknowledged by the real elite. So the bastard bloodlines are too watered down to be useful. Therefore, these people are often as much slaves in the eyes of the elite as those whose names are Anderson or Taylor. We know that the reason the elite need to inbreed is because if their bloodlines are not pure enough, they cannot host an interdimensional being such as Enki and the AIF. We also highly suspect that many of the global elite people have been completely taken over by the alien invader force, also known as the overlords, already, and are now not only remotely run by them, but more directly so. As we discussed in an earlier paper, many souls whom Enki managed to release from the Syrian prison, the Dark Star, are now inhabiting human bodies here on Earth, and these beings were very criminal beings. murderers, so to say. So, but more are waiting to be released when a new chance arises, if ever. The last part is important to remember. Today's elite on the more advanced levels is completely taken over by the renegades from the Syrian prison, where Khan and Lil put them. And here is more. The, between quotation marks, Fisher Kings became one of the terms for the Merovingian kings, who were the elite bloodline of the patriarchal regime, the bloodline which Marduk and Enki decided to protect as their own main elite bloodline. It needed to be protected. Therefore, what can be compared to as a, between quotation marks, police force or semi-military force was created. This force wore the celestial cross, which is the symbol of Ninurta, something that was never spoken of. The Ninurta bloodline survived through Isis' descendants, also known as the Grail bloodline. This police force was, of course, the Knights Templar, and although they had different tasks to perform, the protection of the Holy Grail bloodline was their main duty. The term the Fisher Kings in the section above ultimately refers to the original Fisher King, which according to the Gospels was Jesus. Sir Lawrence Gardner put it neatly in a book, and he wrote many years ago the following. We now know that there are allegories within the Gospels, the use of words that have hitherto been misunderstood. We know that baptismal priests were called fishers, while those who aided them by hauling the baptismal candidates into the boats in large nets were called fishermen, with the candidates themselves being called fishes. The apostles James and John were both ordained fishers, but the brothers Peter and Andrew were lay fishermen, to whom Jesus promised ministerial status, saying, I will make you to become fishers of men. Apart from eventually becoming a fisher, Jesus also was referred to as the Christ, a Greek definition from Christos, which meant the King. In saying the name Jesus Christ, we are actually saying King Jesus, and his kingly heritage was of the royal house of Judah, the house of David, as mentioned numerous times in the Gospels and in the epistles of St. Paul. From AD 33, therefore, Jesus emerged with the dual status of a priest Christ, or, as is more commonly cited in Grail lore, a fisher king, and this definition, as we shall see, was to become the hereditary and dynastic office of Jesus' heirs. And these succeeding fisher kings were paramount in the continuing bloodline of the Holy Grail. Jesus is portrayed as King Jesus, and sometimes as the King of Kings, I.E, the Khan.us, Khan.ur, and who is the Syrians' Kanus, Kanur, Marduk, Although the Knights Templars, under false premises, protected the female line of Queen Isis, also known as Mary Magdalene. Gardner mentions this as well in his Bloodline of the Holy Grail. Here a quotation of his book. This was especially apparent during the age of chivalry, which embraced a respect for womanhood, as exemplified by the Knights Templars, whose constitutional oath supported a veneration of the Grail Mother, Queen Mary Magdalene. By Isis and Marduk creating this new bloodline, Marduk is laying claim to the throne that Ninurta has inherited. In fact, the Isis-Marduk bloodline becomes what is referred to as the Grail line, or that of the Fisher Kings. They are signifying the aquatic bird tribe of Enki/Nergal, which we were discussing earlier in conjunction with the Syrian wars and the Dark Star. This bloodline has been very well protected throughout history, and something similar to a, between quotation marks, police force was formed already at an early stage. Isis/Ishtar/Lilith/Inanna now becomes the handmaiden to Enki/Nergal. The secret police is wearing one of Ninurta's symbols, the, between quotation marks, celestial cross, to signify that they are protecting the seed line of Isis/Ishtar/Inanna. The offspring are now direct descendants of Ninurta and are thereby claiming his right to the throne of Orion, or better known as Arion, which was given to him by Kan-Enlil and Queen Nin. Ninurta's inheritance, which Enki claims, includes the Earth, Sagittarius, the constellation directly related to the center of the Milky Way galaxy, Ursa Major, and a lot of other asterisms belonging to the Orion Empire. The tribe of Dan becomes a direct line as well to Ninurta's throne via the seed line created by Marduk and Isis. So those who are of the tribe of Dan and are still alive on earth today are the offspring of Marduk and Isis. Isis then becomes the, between quotation marks, Eve of this bloodline, and she is instructed to have sex with the progeny of this seed line to keep it as pure as possible. In the ancient records, it is said she has a temple where this takes place, and she is working as the, between quotation marks, breeder, foremost as Inanna and Ishtar. She then becomes known as the, what is known as harlot, or the whore of Babylon. It is her seed line that is the one designed to rule the earth, and the way it was done, this seed line has a direct link to Prince Ninurta of Orion. This is a serious attempt by Enki and his son to take the power away from Ninurta and give it to themselves, believing that the more purity they can provide via themselves and a long line of progenies, the better their chances are to inherit the throne of Orion in a more, between quotation marks, legal way, regardless of what the Queen and the King of Orion, better known as Arion, think about them. So, however, Enki is now out of the equation. Enki's and Marduk's hope is that the rulers of Orion will have no choice other than to accept them. For this to work, they believe the father and son need to seed a long line of progenies for the laws of Orion to take effect in their favor. They probably understand that this may be a long shot, but these beings are obsessed, tremendously obsessed with succeeding, and they are taking everything they can into consideration. This does not at all exclude a real invasion of the inner sanctuaries of the Orion Empire, and if this option needs to be played out, which seems to be the case, humanity is also involved in this big time, working as foot soldiers for Enki and Marduk. There are three notable passages in the above quote from paper 13 worth elaborating upon, and I want to begin with the third passage, starting with this is a serious attempt by Enki and his son to take the power away from the Nirta and give it to themselves. I highlighted this section to show the reader why Orion is very concerned about us humans having babies. It is because we are then contributing to the overlord's success in spreading their royal blood and therefore having a better chance of gaining power in Orion. So this gives another in-depth in the whole situation here on Earth. Thus, my source of Orion told me to spread the message that if a person knows this information, they must not have children because then they are not serious about wanting to help humankind and the Orion quest. And that may have consequences for those who have children regardless, and then go to Orion. They do not look kindly at this because it might put the entire universe in jeopardy. No one wants the overlords to be in charge of Orion. So we who know must refrain ourselves from reproducing. Well, not only because of that, but to be very honest, if we look the entire world scenario and where they want to put the human soul into, I would question a lot if you would indeed bring children into this world. And then I mean the entire singularity metaverse prison system. But not only that, the majority of the children nowadays are already born in a cyborg body. Why is Sagittarius the constellation directly connected to the galactic center? So important. Well, in the Wes Penre papers, Wes Penre mentions that those in charge of the nano world rule the universe. Orion, as explained in earlier work, is the nano world, or the nanoverse as I call it, dash the Ka. I have also hypothesized that the Milky Way galaxy is Orion, and again, the real name is Arion. So they deliberately told us a wrong name. And that each galaxy is its own universe. Therefore, I think Sagittarius is so important because those who are in control of the galactic center are also in control of the Orion universe. The sixth um, density beings channeled in the raw material also consider each galaxy to be a separate universe. Souls created in this universe cannot travel to other galaxies/universes because in those other rules um, apply, and our souls would be destroyed if we could try. So, Wes Penre mentioned that Isis has a temple where she is breeding with the progeny of the Enki seed line. This may have been correct in ancient times, but what about now? Also, what about in the era of the Merovingian kings? Did Isis have offspring with them? These rituals take place in temples belonging to these royalties. In fact, as mentioned in David Icke's research from 1999, the Merovingians performed mysterious, between quotation marks, magical rituals away from public scrutiny, so it is not historically known what these rituals entailed. Were these the places where the incarnated Isis, even long after Mary Magdalene died, sometimes copulated with the kings? We can only guess. However, if you remember from earlier in this book, I referred to the German Templars seeing an apparition of Isis telling them to raise a temple in her honor, which they did. That was in the 13th century. Did that have something to do with breeding? If it did, was Isis producing children with surviving progenies of the Marduk-Isis-Ninurta bloodline to keep it going? Perhaps unrelated, an ancient temple dedicated to Isis in the 3rd century BCE, around 280 BCE, was restored and partially rebuilt between 1960 and 1970, and it was moved, stone by stone, to an island called Agilka in Egypt. The temple is called the Philae Temple. There's a photo in the book of this. And below this is the Rosicrucian Museum. The Rosicrucian being the protectors of the Marduk-Isis-Ninurta bloodline. Nice connection there. Has this place being used since the 1970s to keep the Holy Grail alive? Or was it built for future use for that same purpose? The temple is open to public, but of course, only between certain hours. If this location is used as a breeding location for the sacred bloodline, it is perfectly placed on an island where you need a boat to visit. It is a simple task to gain privacy. And with this said, I also go now into the chapter 11, Wars of the Roses. In mythology, the first red roses are said to have arisen from the blood of Adonis for the love of Aphrodite. Thus, they have become symbolic of love and often resurrection. In Christian symbolism, the red rose stands for the blood shed by Jesus on the cross. It has also become a symbol for earthly love, a tradition which continues today, such as Valentine's Day. The rose may represent the Virgin Mary, and thus virginity or fertility and passion. It is beauty and perfection, happiness and grace, yet it is also sensuality and seduction. Roses and lilies have been symbols of Mary since earliest times, the rose emblematic of her purity, glory, and sorrow, was her attribute as Queen of Heaven and a symbol of her love for God and for Christ, her son. The lily represented her immaculate purity, her innocence and virginity. All right, so this is what is being stated under mythology. Chapter 11, the rose is an ancient symbol and part of Wars of the Roses. And as we can see in the first quote above, it goes back at least to the second construct with Isis as Aphrodite in Greek mythology. As most people know, the rose is also a symbol of love, and who is the goddess of love? Well, Isis slash Aphrodite slash Inanna slash Ishtar, same deity. It is also a symbol for Jesus, the Virgin Mary, and thus Mary Magdalene, the two latter being the same person, and the divine feminine within secret societies, such as the Rosicrucians, the Golden Dawn, and the Oto. The rose represents the Jesus slash Magdalene bloodline. Jesus' blood. The rose is a part of their emblems, usually attached to the cross. The color of the rose is often significant in our daily life if we are in love. We usually give the lady in question a red rose, while the black rose can sometimes symbolize hatred, despair, death, rebirth, and so on. In this chapter, we will specifically focus on the red and the white roses. Since these two roses and these two rose colors are represented in the famous Wars of the Roses, fought between the houses of Lancaster and York for the English throne between 1455 and 1485, so 30-year-old war. The esoteric connotation of the white rose is very similar to that of the red rose, but also denotes new beginnings, something new that replaces the old. From Christian iconography of Mary and the Christ child to ancient Greek and Roman myths about a goddess of love, Venus, white roses have always held a divine connotation. White roses can also symbolize hope and the promise of new beginnings. The white rose also symbolizes the birth of Aphrodite, also known as Isis, the divine feminine from the esoteric perspective of secret societies, such as those mentioned above, adding certain branches of Freemasonry to the list. But for most, as it is being used in such societies and currently as the symbol of Yorkshire, England, denotes the purity of the Virgin Mary. So the wars were named after the emblems of the two houses, the white rose of York and the red rose of Lancaster. Eventually, the House of Tudor of the Lancaster branch, the Red Rose, won this civil war when Henry Tudor, Henry VII, defeated and killed Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, and the wars ended. King Henry VII then united the houses by marriage. The feud is completed and complicated. The feud is complicated, and so much happened back and forth that it is a subject for an entire book. So I will stick to what is relevant to this writing. It is easy otherwise to get lost in the political scene of England in the 15th century. So how the House of Lancaster came to power. After the reign of Edward III, who reigned from 1327 to 77, the House of Plantagenet was divided into two sections. Edward's son, Edward the Black Prince, as he was called, formed the House of Lancaster, while his brother Edmund of York founded the House of York. Because Edward the Black was the eldest, he was appointed as Edward the Third's successor of the English throne. However, Edward the Black died 1 year before his father died in 1377, but had a son, Richard II, who became the next king of England. Being of the Lancaster clan, Richard was childless, so his branch of the family tree ended with him, wherewith his first cousin, Henry IV of the Lancaster clan, became the next regent. The Lancaster clan went back to the Merovingians because Henry IV's father, John of Gaunt, who was not a king, married Constance of Castile, who was French. The French bloodline was always the primary Holy Grail bloodline, most closely protected by the Catholic Church. Therefore, Henry IV had French blood in his veins. The York side of the family tree had no recent French ancestry. Mary, Elizabeth, Sophia, and red hair. When I see the names Mary, Elizabeth, and Sophia in the royal family trees, I pay attention. Often they are significant in one way or another, and some of them may positively have been Mary/Isis reborn. I also look for I also look for sudden red-haired women among the royals coming up from so-called nowhere. Some of them have mysterious backgrounds and sport red hair, although their ancestors seem to not have it. So red hair is a significant trait within the Isis bloodline. It also helps those whom it may concern to trace her lineage to a degree, as we shall see. Many Marys and Elizabeths were redheads. Not so Mary the Bohun, Henry the Fourth's consort, from what we are told. She died young in childbirth, but birthed the next king in line, Henry V. There is no evidence that Mary de Bohun was Mary/Isis, but she carried the name Mary. And she was significant because it seems like a plot was instigated during her and Henry the Fourth's reign to put their son Henry V on the throne of France. Whether or not Mary was Isis, it appears she had pure blood, and they apparently wanted to strengthen the French bloodline. Therefore, Henry married Catherine of Valois, who was French. The reason Catherine married the English monarch Henry V was to fulfill the plan to put him on the throne of France as a DNA booster. Although Catherine managed to put her son, Henry VI, on the French throne for a while, the plan failed. Henry VI had a son, Edward of Lancaster, but he died young without having a successor. However, Catherine did not give up. After Henry V's death, she remarried Owen Tudor, and the two started the House of Tudor lineage. More about them in a minute. It was during Henry VI's reign that Richard of York disputed the Lancasters' right to rule England, probably because Henry ascended to the French throne. Thus, Richard of York's son, Edward IV, took over when Henry IV went to France in 1461, and he ruled until 1470, when Henry IV came back to England and regained the throne of England, thus taking it back from Edward IV. However, Henry IV conveniently died in 1471, where after Edward of the York clan claimed the throne once more. Until his death in 1483, the throne remained with the House of York, when Edward's brother Richard III succeeded the throne. This didn't sit well, of course, with the House of Lancaster, and the dispute led to the final battle in the Wars of the Roses, where Henry Tudor, later known as Henry VII, defeated and killed King Richard III in the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, which ended the war that had lasted on and off for 30 years. Henry Tudor now became the King of England, ruling as Henry VII, the first monarch of the House of Tudor. He ended the conflict of the Roses, also called the 30 Years' War, by marrying a princess of the House of York and thereby merged both houses. A House of York incarnation of Isis? Our story does not end here, however, which is partially why I included this chapter. I think that amid all this we have an incarnation of Isis lurking when we follow the plots in the Wars of the Roses. We can quite clearly see the War of the Bloodlines played out. It becomes obvious that Enki and Marduk wanted someone from the House of Lancaster to inherit the throne of France. But despite heavy efforts, the Lancasters failed. They put two of their own on the French throne, but none of them had offspring, which means the Jesus-Magdalene bloodline could not survive through that lineage during the 30 Years' War. So they were back on the drawing board again. So let us look at the House of York for a moment. King Edward IV, who took over when Henry VI went to France, married Elizabeth Woodville, earlier Elizabeth Grey. See for this the family tree chart, which I also have links from in the text box. This was an interesting lady and possibly an incarnation of Isis. The reason for her marrying Edward IV was to find her way into the Lancaster bloodline through the Tudors, and from there put her DNA into the heir of the French throne, which she succeeded in doing for a while. What stands out about Elizabeth, besides her name, a title for the mother goddess, is that she was a redhead, and there are no records of her birth. History books have tried to place her as the daughter of Jacquetta of Luxembourg. She apparently was raised by her, but there are no records that Jacquetta was her biological mother. Elizabeth's DNA mixed with the Tudor family later on often created redheads. It used to puzzle historians that so many Tudors had red hair. But the conclusion was that the red hair came from Elizabeth Woodville. So Isis is legendarily known as the goddess of love, sex, and war. Elizabeth played a key role in the Wars of the Roses and a crucial role in securing the accession of Henry VII of the House of Tudor in 1485 after Richard III was slain. She made sure her daughter Elizabeth of York, another red-haired Elizabeth, married Henry Tudor, which also happened. This ended the wars, which was exactly what Elizabeth as a potential Isis wanted, because now she saw her chance to get her DNA into the French royal bloodline. Again, not directly, but via her granddaughter with Henry VII, Mary Tudor, yet another Mary. Mary Tudor. Mary Tudor was briefly Queen of France and the third wife of Louis XII. So, see the French royal family tree in the appendix. This link is also mentioned in the text box. Louis was more than 30 years older than Mary, who married him when she was 18 and he was about 50. However, they were only married very briefly, desperately trying to produce an heir, but some say Louis was too old for such bedroom adventures, and he died without being able to impregnate Mary. Others say he died from a gout, but either way, no heir was produced. So after Louis XII's death, there was a big problem, placing Mary somewhere in the French court. So again, the strengthening of the Jesus-Magdalene bloodline in France failed. The fascinating continuous story about Jane Grey. Elizabeth Woodville's first marriage before she married King Edward IV was with John Grey of Groby, a minor supporter of the Lancaster clan. However, he died at the Second Battle of St. Albans, leaving Elizabeth a widowed mother of two sons. We know next to nothing about these two children. Still, Elizabeth's granddaughter, Mary Tudor, through her older daughter, Frances, was the maternal grandmother of Jane Grey, the famous teenager who was the Queen of England for 9 days in July 1553 before she was burned at the stake for claiming she could hear divine voices in her head. So why is this interesting? Well, it amplifies the constant struggle with keeping the bloodlines pure. When Elizabeth the First sat on the throne of England later in the 1500s, she succeeded Mary, Queen of Scots, whom she executed by beheading her. Mary, yet another Mary, and another Elizabeth had a son who became James the Sixth of Scotland, and later James the First of England. James the First was the one who authorized the translation of the King James Bible. Elizabeth did not want James as her successor. Instead, she conspired with John Dee, her famous court magician and advisor, to put Jane Grey on the throne instead. Elizabeth herself was without an heir. She did not want to marry because she had learned that men who married queens did so because they wanted to usurp the throne and get the power for themselves. Thus, she had no known children. The choice of Jane Grey is interesting because she was a direct descendant of Elizabeth Woodville of the House of York, whom I suspect was Isis. Therefore, Jane Grey was of pure bloodline. Queen Elizabeth I and John Dee managed to put the teenage Jane Grey on the throne of England. But because of her clairvoyance, she was deemed a so-called witch and was burned at the stake. She claimed to have a direct channel with Jesus, among other divine beings. After Jane had been executed, James the Sixth of Scotland, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, also became the King of England as James the First. I have mentioned elsewhere that people of the purest bloodlines can easily be possessed by the overlords, and perhaps Jane Grey was no exception. And with this said, I have come to the end of reading two chapters this time. And next time I continue with chapter 12, that is all about the Windsor bloodline. And then we are slowly but very surely moving towards the storyline of Princess Diana, who has had a lot of Isis symbolism around her. And the Windsor Bloodline chapter is quite a chapter because there we have at the end the entire story, or better said, this an, a piece of the story of Princess Diana. All right, so this chapter 12 I will probably do in two sections. Yeah, depends on, I need to count the amount of pages. But in actuality, the Windsor bloodline, an interesting bloodline. And as we can learn from this book, the story of Isis and the war on bloodlines, we can learn that all the wars in this world all have to do with bloodlines. Unfortunately, we humans, because we are not always aware of this, and we have become part of this also. Um, so not all wars are what they look like and seem like, and what is being told to us that the topic is about. We all know, well, better said, I have the idea that many people nowadays know that many presidents of the United States have royal connections in one way or another, and especially connections with the English and English throne and the throne of France. So this is interesting, and then you get a better connection also why the things are happening in the Middle East. All right. This is also one of the reasons why I present you this book in live book readings, better said through live book readings, because I think this can give a lot of in-depth information and understanding more deeply about this whole Isis, Marduk, and Enki storyline, which is still being played out in today's life in so many ways and forms. All right, I want to thank you for tuning in through Facebook, through Rumble, through YouTube. Thank you for taking some time to listen to this information. I wish you all a beautiful, joyful day filled with a lot of love, wisdom, and revelations, all coming from your own spirit. And let us listen to a beautiful piece of music um, called River in the Ice, and it is made by Ben Sound. I see you the next time. This will be after the weekend, and have a joyful weekend too. Thank you so much again, and see you next time.